So last hour we kind of did a big picture view of evolution, and in these remaining few sessions I want to zero in on some specific questions that fall in this broader picture. And this hour I want to focus our whole attention on this question of Adam and Eve, and this has come to the forefront of the discussion, I think, largely through the influence of biologos and theistic evolutionists, Francis Collins and his colleagues. And it's a really disturbing issue. It's one thing to say we all came from some sort of primate or some sort of goo. That's really an attack on Scripture. Fossils they've used to support that question. With genetics, now you can make quantitative arguments about how many individuals were alive at a particular time. This is recent data, and what the theistic evolutionists are saying is that the genetic data says two people is not a possible explanation. So think about the history of the origins debate. You've got a whole range of views. You've got old earth creationists. Yes, we accept the time scale, we don't accept evolution, and we endorse Adam and Eve, a literal Adam and Eve. The theistic evolutionists are saying you can't do that. It's more black and white. You're either a young earth creationist, or you've got to, if you're going to accept science, you've got to accept the rejection of Adam and Eve. They say it's just not possible. And so they've gone on radio, and they've really made this a topic. And I think they've really, even the PCA, this of course now, Tim Keller and such, they're having to deal with this question. They're allied with biologos folks, and it's these biologos folks who are insisting you can't hold to an Adam and Eve. You go to their website, they've got theologians, of course, who will post, well, maybe we need to reinterpret Romans 5. Maybe we need to reinterpret 1 Corinthians 15. So what are these chapters? These are core gospel chapters. One man sins, one man saves, and this genetic discussion is driving these theologians to reconsider that. So the heart of the gospel is now being questioned, supposedly because of modern genetics. So we want to deal with this question: does genetics make the concept of two people as the progenitors of the human race invalid? Let me just run you through briefly the spectrum of claims. This has been popular probably ever since 2005 when the chimpanzee DNA sequence was published. This is from Nature magazine. They said, what makes us human? We share more than 98% of our DNA and almost all of our genes with our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. And of course, museums have jumped on this. There's a strong emotional appeal in that number. People hear 98% similar. It just seems like, man, are we kissing cousins? It makes that relationship seem more persuasive. That's one aspect of the DNA, the genetics argument. There's another aspect, according to the fossil record that the evolutionists cite, humans evolved from some ape-like creature in Africa. So Lucy, one of those famous fossils, Ardipithecus, these supposedly transitional form fossils, they're largely being dug up in Africa. Hence, the evolutionists say humans evolved out of Africa. Well, now they're using genetics to say genetics is consistent with this. And so here's another aspect of genetics. Not only does it have an emotional appeal, now it seems like we're having two different disciplines agreeing on the same answer, and that's troubling, perhaps to some individuals as well. And then, of course, the claim I refer to, this is from the Biologos website. Just a quote from them: genetic evidence shows that humans descended from a group of several thousand individuals who lived about 150,000 years ago. In the last session this afternoon, we'll deal with the time question. This morning, I'm going to draw your attention to that claim, several thousand individuals. And they've made it very clear, Adam and Eve, as a literal couple, is not consistent with the genetic evidence. So that's the breakdown of what we want to cover. What does genetics say about who we are? Are we people or are we primates? Are we genetically unique, or do we look like we're just highly evolved chimps? What does genetics say about where humans came from? And then that question of two people or a whole population of several thousand individuals. And just so we can all be on the same page, genetics can get complicated quickly, so I just want to walk through some very basic genetic principles, some genetic specifics, so we're all on the same page. And I don't intend to get into anything too complex. So I want to make three very basic observations. This will lead us to three very basic genetic principles and then a few specifics from it, and that's all you need to know. So don't be intimidated. There are a number of families in this room. I'm just going to put a family on the screen. And even if you don't know other people in this room, you can probably see who goes with whom. Well, that's that person's child, because there's a resemblance. But I want to make a point that's even more basic than that. When we look at human families, even if we look at other species, humans produce something consistent. Humans produce humans. And that's a kindergarten point. Here's a family. That's a kindergarten point, but there's something really profound. Humans don't produce elephants. Well, of course. But that has profound scientific ramifications. There must be something during the reproductive process that says human and not ape or dog. And that's just from looking at the room around us. Thanks to modern technology, we can see that at the point of conception, there is not a tiny little human that is passed on that kind of gets blown up like a balloon. Humans begin as a single cell. Sperm meets egg, and that cell begins dividing, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells. And here's sort of the stages over time in the womb. That form is sculpted. So life begins at conception, but it begins as a single cell, and the form that we're familiar with at the adult stage and at birth is something that's built over time. Therefore, what gets passed on must be a set of instructions. So 100, 200 years ago, people thought there was kind of a tiny human that gets passed on and then just expands. That's not consistent. There's a set of instructions that gets passed on. Third observation. So if you look at this family, yes, there is a human form that's passed on, and it's in the form of a set of instructions. But each generation looks slightly different than the previous generation. This guy is not a carbon copy of his dad. This son obviously has features of both mom and dad. So just looking at, again, the room around you, or at this family, we can see that change happens every generation. And since humans pass on a set of instructions, it'd be logical to also infer that change happens to those instructions. So we haven't gotten really into any DNA, and we've already got a handle on three very basic genetic principles. Humans produce humans. Humans don't begin with the adult form. It's built over time, and that instruction changes over time. Now, a little bit of DNA. DNA is actually what gets passed on at conception. Sperm has DNA, egg has DNA, so half of it comes from mom, half of it from dad. That's the first genetic principle. Secondly, DNA is what controls that developmental process. It is the set of instructions. So when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, they didn't know this. But in the last 150 years, this is what's been discovered. And DNA controls that early stage. It controls the developmental process. 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells. It controls the development here as well. So it is the set of instructions, excuse me, that gets passed on. Thirdly, a little bit more, a few more principles. So I said sperm and egg, you get half your DNA from mom, half from dad. That means each individual then has 2 copies. So I've thrown out the number 3 billion DNA letters. We actually have 6 billion, 2 times 3 billion. So 3 billion from mom, 3 billion from dad. So grandpa has 2 copies of DNA. Grandma has 2 copies of DNA, but each parent only passes on 1. And the copy that gets passed on is kind of a blending of these 2. Grandpa makes a copy of his DNA, passes it on, but it's a mix of these 2 versions. Grandma makes a copy, it's a mix of these 2 versions. Sorry, that's kind of washed out. That gets passed on to son, and so then he has 2 copies again. And that 2 copy number maintains itself from generation to generation. He marries a wife, she has 2 copies. Now when they each make a copy, again it's a blending of their 2 versions, they each pass on 1 to their son, and on the cycle goes. So that's one way that DNA changes ever so slightly each generation, because it not only comes from, 1 copy comes from each parent, but the copy that does come from each parent is a mix of the 2 versions in that parent. You don't need to follow all those details, just know that there's 2 copies in each individual. And that's what one copy gets passed on. Now, 3 principles, just a few specifics. We talked about DNA being a book last night, and I want to run with that analogy. So, books have chapters and paragraphs and sentences and words that consist of letters. The DNA sequence is really a series of letters. Here's that helix again. It looks kind of like a ladder. Each of the rungs of the ladder represents a letter. I've only highlighted a few of them, the different colors. It's color-coded so you can see it. So DNA is basically a chemical alphabet. Now, when you read a book in English, we have rules that we follow when we read, left to right. There's an orientation that we all agree on when we're communicating. Well, there's an orientation to DNA as well. Now, DNA is even more complex than our language because you can read it forwards and backwards. And which writer writes 2 novels in one book where you get one story this way, one story if you read it backwards? We haven't been able to do that. But DNA is enormously complex. There's an enormous amount of information compression. It has an orientation, and the arrangement of those letters carries meaning. Now we can modify this diagram ever so slightly, not only to see another aspect of change. Not only does Grandpa pass on a mix of his DNA and Grandma passes on a mix of DNA, but when they copy their DNA sequence, they copy it imperfectly. Now, that's no reason for hysteria. Again, there's 3 billion letters, 6 billion total in each human, and only about 60 of those letters are changed. Only about 60 mistakes happen each generation between the 2 of them. So 60 out of 3 billion, 6 billion, that's not much. So about 60 changes when this son is conceived. When this son's conceived, about another 60 changes there as well. And so over time, more and more changes accumulate. So we've been around 6,000 years. We have more mistakes than Adam did, more mistakes than Noah did. And you can use this, and I'll get to it in a moment, to establish genealogies. So from grandpa to his son, 60 mistakes. The difference between grandpa and grandson is 60 plus 60, 120. So as each generation passes, more and more mistakes accumulate. And this is where it gets really important. You can use that principle, mistakes happening each generation, to establish genealogy. So let's modify our diagram, just look at the men here. Grandpa to son, 60 mistakes. Son to grandson, 60 mistakes, 120 between the 2. Now, if I told you that I have 3 individuals, I didn't tell you who they were, I just said they're related, and all you know is that there are 3 individuals and that these are the DNA differences between them, you could use these numbers to establish a genealogy. The bigger the DNA difference, the bigger the difference in genealogical relationship. So if all you knew is that there are 3 people, they differ by these DNA letters, you could say, well, okay, whoever these 2 guys are, this must be the furthest genealogical relationship. These guys have a close relationship, these guys have a close relationship. And whether this or this is grandfather, you wouldn't know, but you'd know that this represents the deepest genealogical divide, deepest generational divide. Flip that around. You're the closest genetically to your immediate relatives. And we use that principle in paternity testing. So in cases where mom's pregnant, doesn't know who the dad is, you can test the baby's DNA, and that baby will match genetically most closely to mom and to dad. And so you test several men, and you look for that closest genetic match. So now you can exhale, that's all you need to know about genetics. And we're going to apply that now to those 3 questions. Who are humans? Where do we come from? And how many people began the human race? I've shown you a basic core nuclear family. We can look at different ethnic groups around the globe and apply these same specifics. So let's say that guy I just showed you was from Spain. Let's pretend he's about 500 DNA differences from a Russian. The Russian's about 1,000 from an Aborigine, and the Aborigine is also 1,000 from the Spaniard. You might look at this and say, well, it looks like these guys, their family trees meet more quickly than the family trees of either this guy and the Aborigine or this guy and the Aborigine. So it looks like the Spaniard and the Russian had a common great-great-great-great-great-grandfather more recently than the common grandfather with the Aborigine. Well, the evolutionists apply this principle not just to the human realm, but to other species. They'd say compare the humans as a whole around the planet to, let's say, fossil humans like Neanderthals. Let's say, pretend there's 2,000 DNA differences there. They'll say there's maybe 3,000 DNA differences between the Neanderthals and the chimpanzees, and let's say about 5,000 between chimpanzees and humans. See, same principle. Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. What's the big deal? I made up those numbers. The numbers they cite more typically is this 98% similarity figure. But that's the principle behind it. We use paternity testing in the human realm to establish who's related to whom. Why not apply it to other species? So that's how the logic goes. Well, what's the problem here? I mentioned in this little test, we can, in the nuclear family, the core family, we can use these numbers to establish relationship. Well, let's ask the question, how do we know that method works? Well, because we've first tested the method on families for which we know the relationships. We have written historical record of who's related to whom. And if you then compare the DNA sequences, oh, look, the DNA sequence matches the genealogy. Well, that raises the question, what historical record do we have to verify the common ancestry of humans and chimpanzees? How do we know that the paternity test that we apply to humans also works when we compare humans to the species? We don't. It's an extrapolation beyond the data. But that's not the only problem. That 98% figure is wrong. And in fact, the real number was buried in the original paper, but it took a while to figure that out. So my colleague Jeff Tompkins has published a paper. You don't need to read all that text. It's just to show you that it's out there. He published in the creationist peer-reviewed literature. So what my colleague Jeff Tompkins did is he said he downloaded all the raw chimpanzee sequence, the DNA sequence. It's, again, about 2 to 3 billion letters. Chopped it up, and you can do this electronically with computers very quickly. Chopped it up into little fragments, and then electronically compared it piece by piece to the human sequence. And he got a similarity of only 70%. Well, if you go back to the original paper, which the chimpanzee sequence is published, so human was published 2001, chimpanzee 2005, the writers say that they compared about 2.2 million letters between humans and chimpanzees. They took the chimpanzee sequence, compared it to human, then they took the stuff that matched, compared it to chimpanzee, and so anything that didn't match very well, they discarded. And the stuff that matched, now it's 98% similar. And if you add up the numbers, 3 billion minus about 2.2 million, anyways, if you do the math, you come up with a number that's very close. So this isn't just a creationist conclusion, it's in that original paper if you look carefully. Well, what does this mean practically? We're 70% genetically identical, which means we're 30% different. Well, 30% times 3 billion means we're 900 million DNA differences from the chimpanzee. There are 900 million letter differences between us and chimpanzees. 900 million. That doesn't feel quite as close as 98%, does it? That's not what's being talked about in the public. So what does the genetics say about the origin of humans? We don't look like primates at all. Now, 70% similar? Well, we share a lot of anatomy and physiology with chimpanzees, so that's no surprise. But in terms of the emotional aspect, 900 million, tell that to your neighbors and see what they say. And there's more, but for sake of time, I'm just going to skip that. There's more nuanced arguments, which we've published answers to. So if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to address those. Or if you have specific situations, I can point you to the appropriate resources. Our books cover them as well. What about the question of where we came from? Well, we know from Scripture we came originally from Eden, but about 1,700 years after the Garden of Eden, that was wiped out in the global flood, and mankind, the total population was reduced to 8. And really, modern humans all come from 6 people. Noah had 3 sons. Those 3 sons came out of the ark. They had wives. These 3, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, these 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So this verse tells us that even if Noah and his wife could have had other children, other daughters, modern humans come from these 3 couples. And so genetics should be traceable back to these 8 people, and specifically these three couples, every ethnic group comes from there. And the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat, and presumably then they restarted civilization round about the Middle East. And so every ethnic group ultimately should be able to be traceable back to the center of the map there, essentially. Of course, that raises a question. How do you get all this variety in appearance from just 6 couples? Well, really, in terms of skin tone, let's use that example. The difference between light skin and dark skin is just how much melanin you have. It's not some fundamental human, non-human. That's an evolutionary idea. It's really dark-skinned folks have a lot of melanin, light-skinned folks make very little. Now let's apply something we just discussed. We said every one of us has 2 copies of DNA. Pass on 1 copy. Grandma passes on 1, so he keeps 2, she has 2, he has 2. That means Noah and Mrs. Noah, for lack of a name, also had 2 copies of DNA. And my guess is they were not identical. My guess is Adam and Eve were not identical. Why? Well, if Adam and Eve had the exact same DNA sequence, no differences, so Adam had identical copies and these 2 were identical to Eve's, they would have produced clones. Every one of their children would look the same until a few mistakes were introduced, and my guess is that's not how God would have designed it. He would have designed variety from the start. Look at how much diversity there is on Earth. So my guess is these 2 had differences. And let's pretend, for sake of argument, that the amount of melanin in your skin is controlled by 1 section of DNA sequence. And let's say if you have a DNA sequence that says make a lot of melanin, we'll give that a capital M. And let's pretend Noah had 1 capital M on 1 copy. And let's say if you have a version of DNA that says don't make any, it just maybe it's not functioning anymore. You have a small m for a lowercase m for little melanin. Let's say Mrs. Noah had the same genetic structure. What would their children have looked like? And let's say if you have 2 capital M's, you have both of your copies say yes, make a lot of melanin, you're dark skinned. If you have 1 copy, you've got 1 that says do it, 1 that's not doing anything, you're lighter skinned. And if you've got 2 lowercase, you're white skinned. It's more complex than that, but it keeps the argument simple. So what would their children have looked like? Well, they'd only pass on 1 version of each to their kids. Noah passes on a copy. Mrs. Noah passes on a copy. So if Noah passes on a capital M and Mrs. Noah passes on a capital M, what do their children look like? What does that child look like? He looks dark-skinned. So if Noah passes on capital, Mrs. Noah lowercase, you get a brown-skinned child. Same thing if that situation is reversed. If they both pass on a lowercase m, they have white children. So from 2 people, you can get the whole spectrum. I thought I had an example. I deleted that. Too bad. I had a picture of an interracial couple. So today, if someone from Nigeria, and this was a German couple, I think she was from, I don't know if she was Sudanese or Nigerian, married a light-skinned German, and their children were intermediate in skin tone. So there's nothing fundamentally different among the ethnic groups. It's just the amount of melanin. And you can easily get all these varieties from the Middle East very quickly. Now, what does the genetics say? That's the question we're getting at. What does the genetics say about relationships? Remember, the smaller the DNA difference, the closer the genealogical relationship. The deeper the DNA difference, the more distant the genealogical relationship. So what are the DNA differences among the different ethnic groups? They all came from Noah's family. What does it say, and what do the evolutionists make of it? So again, we said for sake of argument, let's say this Aborigine is about 1,000 from the Russian. Let's say the Aborigine is about 500 from that Vietnamese man, and the Vietnamese man is also 500 from the Russian. And let's say the Russian's about 600 from a North American Indian. North American Indian's about 400 from a Peruvian. What do you guess the difference is between the Peruvian and the African? It's higher. It's about 2,000. The deepest DNA differences are between African groups and other groups. So it's about 2,000, and I'm just making these numbers up for sake of illustration. 2,000 among these. However, the deepest groups are also between different African ethnic groups. So this is, I think, a Namibian woman, and let's say you compare someone from Namibia to Ethiopia, you'll also see very stark DNA differences. The deepest DNA differences are between African and non-African groups and between different African ethnic groups. So the evolutionists say, see, you apply that principle, the bigger the DNA difference, the deeper the genealogical relationship. Therefore, all humans began in Africa. Well, Africa is not that far from the Middle East, but there are other explanations here. I mentioned earlier that on average, the amount of DNA differences that change from generation to generation is about 60. Now, if I recall correctly, that's been measured in white groups. There may have been a few African measurements. The point is, it's been measured in subpopulations. It hasn't been measured in every ethnic group on the planet. Let's think about this as well. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, along with Noah and his wife, step off the ark, and they're probably going to pass on mistakes to their offspring as well. What if there were very slight differences? So I said on average, about 60 mistakes happen per generation. But what if these guys mutate by about 70? It doesn't seem like much. And maybe Japheth's descendants mutate about 50. Well, you do several, 4,000 years worth of generations, you're going to start seeing some significant differences between their descendants. So a very slight deviation in the rate of change will produce that sort of hierarchy. So it may be that Africans pass on 61 mutations per generation. And so after 4,000 years, there are more differences between them and other groups, and between different ethnic groups, than we might expect. The evolutionists assume, just like they do in geology, that rates of change are the same. So to say the deepest DNA differences are in Africa, therefore humans evolved in Africa, is an unjustified assumption. It's their uniformitarian assumption. We'll talk about that more this afternoon. So the bottom line here is, out of Africa is one of many explanations. Just because Africans genetically are, on average, more different from non-Africans doesn't tell us that we originated in Africa. It may have something to do with how fast they change. And let me give you some data that is consistent with this. So, for those of you who are interested, I mentioned, let me just go back to the slide so we can see this more clearly. This DNA gets mixed up slightly when it gets passed on. This DNA gets mixed up slightly when it gets passed on. It appears that Africans mix it a little bit more quickly, or more so than non-Africans. So there's already a preliminary line of evidence to say assuming constant rates of change is a bad assumption. So don't be intimidated when someone says, see, genetics matches the fossil record. No, genetics matches the fossil record only if you apply the assumptions of evolution all over the place. So the genetic data are consistent with an origin of all humans from a common ancestor near the Middle East. Now the sticky question, and the one that really strikes at the heart of the gospel. Did humans come from two people or from a population? Now we could spend a really long time on this, and the arguments that evolutionists use to try to disprove Adam and Eve are varied. And the genetics get really complicated really fast. So I'm just going to deal with sort of the general argument, and if this is something that comes up and you need specific answers, we can deal with that afterwards. Basically, the argument goes like this. Let's pretend humans, individuals, are like marbles. And so if you've got a population of individuals, they have DNA differences among them. That's what we see today. If you were to get the DNA sequence from all the people in this room, you'd see differences. So that's what the different colors represent. If catastrophe were to strike the earth, and only 3 people survived, all that DNA variety would basically be lost. It's like a bottleneck. You only shake out a few marbles. Now, all those different marbles, you lose a lot of them, and so those 3 people start reproducing and repopulating the earth. You're not going to see as much DNA variety. That's essentially the argument. The evolutionists say, okay, you got Adam and Eve, 2 people, or you got Noah. Even if you didn't have people prior, it's kind of like a bottleneck. You started with 8 people, which means you started with very little variety. And so you'd expect humans around the planet to be fairly homogeneous. You'd expect us to all be more similar than if we've been around and came from a population of many individuals. So they'd say, I've represented different populations by the X's, and it looks like my color resolution on this projector makes them all look the same. But I guess that makes the point too. So they'd say if we all came from the Middle East and then spread out to Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, maybe over the Bering Strait to North and South America, humans by and large would be very similar. This is a relative term. But if humans originated from many individuals, there was not this shrinking to 8 people, 6 people, but 1,000 people, there'd still be a lot of variety. That's essentially their argument. The problem is evolutionists are really bad at understanding what Scripture says and applying it. Essentially, what I've just told you is the evolutionist saying, let's pretend Noah and his wife were clones. That's really what they're talking about, and I'm oversimplifying it, but to help make the point. By and large, their argument is based on a wrong view of Scripture, and some of the other arguments are based on the same thing. There are other more complicated mathematical models. The basic problem is they don't model what the text says. They don't model that humans started with 6 people and then grew exponentially. They don't model that Noah and his wife probably had DNA varieties, Noah between the 2 copies, and Noah different from Mrs. Noah. If they were homogeneous, then you'd expect the globe to look about the same. Now, if Noah and his wife, just like modern individuals, had variety, Noah's first copy was different from his second copy, both of these were different from Mrs. Noah's 2 copies, you'd expect a pattern that looks more like this. So essentially, all of their arguments are based on a misunderstanding of the text. Not surprisingly, this has a 150-year history. Darwin reacted to a view of species origins that was false. God didn't create every species in their current locations. Species restarted in the Middle East after the flood. And if you go to their website, they list about 3 arguments from genetics that supposedly disprove Adam and Eve. Well, one of the arguments assumes we have a common ancestor with a chimpanzee. Well, there's assuming evolution to prove it. Another one uses that old argument of junk DNA, that most of the human DNA sequence is mistakes. Problem there as well. Another one, again, assumes constant rates of change. So this discussion gets very complex very quickly. The bottom line is there are good answers to all of them, and all of these arguments fail because they don't consider the text. And my colleague Rob Carter, who is a geneticist at Creation Ministries International, has published a number of articles on the creation.com website. If you're looking for more technical rebuttals, he's done a fantastic job showing how modern genetics shows that we can trace back to 2 people so long as you assume they had genetic diversity from the start. So when it comes to a pair or a population, wherever we look in genetics, it points to 2 people. You just got to consider what the text says carefully and not assume evolution to prove it. So what's the bottom line when it comes to genetics and our origins? There's 900 million differences between us and chimpanzees. That's huge. It's nothing like the 98% that gets thrown about. When we look at where we came from geographically, it fits an origin from Ararat quite nicely. The genetics does not say we came out of Australia or New Zealand. It says somewhere near the Middle East. And when we look at the DNA variety among the people in this room, we look at the DNA variety around the planet, it points towards a common ancestor of 2 people. And in the last hour, I'm going to show you some data that says 2 people less than 10,000 years ago. But we'll get to that later. The 98% figure is also covered in this book. Jeff Tompkins wrote the chapter. You may have heard the claim that humans have a chromosome fusion. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. If you do know what I'm talking about, the answer's in this book as well. And I've written some articles summarizing his work on our website. And then those have showed up in Acts and Facts as well. So here's another reason to get that. As we make these discoveries, that's where it shows up. And so here's an article that talks about what I mentioned this morning. Avail yourself of the resources on our website. I finished early for a change, which means we have more time to eat. Hallelujah, right? We'll be back after lunch talking about geology and then genetics and the question of time.